My grandmother's dining room table could seat 12 people. I know this because I counted the chairs every Thanksgiving growing up, the way you count things when you're trying to feel like you belong somewhere. There were 11 of us that Sunday. My grandmother sat at the head. My two older brothers flanked her like bookends, and I sat at the far end next to my aunt, which is where I always sat, which is where you sit when the family has already decided what you are. I had driven 4 hours to be there. Nobody asked me to come. My grandmother called on a Thursday and said there was something important to discuss about the house, and could I make it by Sunday, and I said yes before she even finished the sentence because that is what I had always done. I should back up. Before I tell you what was in the envelope my brother slid across the table before anyone had even touched the bread basket, and before I tell you what my attorney said when I called her from the driveway afterward, let me ask you something first. Have you ever been the person in your family who everyone assumes will just go along with it? Leave a comment and tell me, because I spent 31 years being that person, and I want to know if you understand what that feels like from the inside. I am the youngest of three. My brothers are Callum and Seth. Callum is 41 and has his name on 3 commercial properties in the Nashville area and talks about it constantly. Seth is 38 and does something in finance that he explains differently every time someone asks. I am 31, and for most of my adult life, my family described me as still figuring things out, which is a polite way of saying they had written me off before I had a chance to prove them wrong. The thing is, I had figured things out. I just hadn't told them. 4 years ago, I co-founded a company called Ardenvale with my college roommate, Phoebe. We built compliance software for mid-sized healthcare networks. I know that sounds dry, but stay with me, because the numbers are not dry. 18 months ago, a private equity group acquired Ardenvale. I walked away with $2.4 million after taxes. I paid off my condo. I moved the rest into a brokerage account and a few carefully chosen real estate investments, and I went on living the same quiet life I had always lived, because I had watched what money does to people when they announce it, and I wanted no part of that. My family did not know any of this. As far as they were concerned, I was still the girl who needed to borrow $200 for a car repair in 2019, which I paid back in full and which my brother Callum still brought up at holidays. So when my grandmother called about the house, I assumed it was routine. My grandfather had passed 18 months earlier and the estate had been moving through probate slowly, the way these things do. The house, a 4-bedroom craftsman in Franklin, Tennessee, the house I grew up visiting, the house where my grandmother had lived for 40 years, was the last significant asset. I assumed we were meeting to discuss the sale, or maybe to talk about whether anyone wanted to buy out the others. I did not assume what actually happened. I arrived at noon. My grandmother hugged me at the door and told me I looked thin, which is her version of a greeting. The house smelled like it always does. Coffee and something floral, and for a moment I let myself just stand in the entryway and feel the specific comfort of a place that has never changed. Then I walked into the dining room and saw the folders. There were 3 of them, placed at 3 of the chairs. Mine was the only one without a folder in front of it. Callum was already there, jacket on, which he only does when he wants to seem important. Seth arrived a few minutes later. My aunt, my father's sister, Roberta, was there too. Though my father passed when I was 19 and her presence always makes that grief sit differently in the room. My grandmother came in with coffee. She sat down. She looked at the centerpiece, a little arrangement of dried flowers she'd had for years, and she did not look at me. Callum cleared his throat. We wanted to get together, he said, because there are some decisions to make about the property, and we thought it would be easier to do it in person. I said that made sense. I asked if I could see what was in the folders. Seth said, "We'll get to that." He said it pleasantly, the way you say things to someone you're not worried about. My grandmother finally looked up. She said, "I just want everyone to be taken care of." That's all I've ever wanted. I had a strange feeling then, not alarm exactly, more like the feeling of recognizing a room you've dreamed about. Something was already decided. I was the last to know, and everyone else already knew that I was the last to know, and the meeting had been designed around that fact. Callum slid a folder across the table to me. I opened it. It was a quitclaim deed. My name was on it, in the grantor line. The property listed was my grandmother's house, and in the consideration section, where the law requires that something of value be exchanged, it said $10 and other good and valuable consideration. I set the folder down. I looked at it for a moment. I picked it up again and read it again because I wanted to be sure I understood what I was reading. My grandfather's will had divided the property equally between his 3 grandchildren, Callum, Seth, and me, 1/3 each. The document in front of me was asking me to sign away my 1/3 interest in a house appraised at $940,000 in exchange for $10 so that Callum could become the sole trustee and manager of the property. I looked up at Callum. He was watching me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression he used when he was explaining something to someone he expected to be confused. "We've been talking about this for a few months," he said. "The house makes more sense as a managed asset. I have the infrastructure, the relationships with the property managers. It doesn't make sense to have it divided 3 ways." "You want me to sign over my share?" I said. "We're not asking you to give anything up," Seth said. "You'd still be part of the family." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second. You'd still be part of the family. As if my share of the property and my membership in the family were the same thing, and releasing one was the price of keeping the other. "What's the plan for the house?" I asked. Callum said they were going to rent it out. Long-term tenants, stable income, professionally managed. "And the income?" I said. He paused for just a beat too long. "It would go toward maintenance, taxes, management fees. And what's left over? Any remainder would be reinvested in the property." I looked at my grandmother. She was looking at her hands. "So I give up my 1/3, I said slowly. "And in exchange, I get $10, no future income, no ownership stake, and the privilege of watching my brothers rent out the house I grew up coming to." "You're making it sound adversarial," Seth said. "What part of what I said was inaccurate?" Silence. My Aunt Roberta, who had been very quiet, looked down at the table. She had known, I realized. She had been brought here to make the room feel more legitimate. Callum shifted in his chair. He said, "Look, honestly, let's be real with each other. You're not in a position financially to contribute to the upkeep. You don't have the—" "What position am I in?" I asked. I said it quietly. "I have learned that quiet is more unsettling than loud." He stopped. "You don't have the resources," he said. "We're not saying anything bad about you. That's just the reality." I looked at him for a long moment. 4 years of building something from nothing, 18 months of acquisition negotiations, a wire transfer with more zeros than I had ever seen in my life, all of it quiet, all of it mine, all of it completely invisible to the people in this room. "I need to make a phone call," I said. Callum said we were in the middle of a conversation. "I'll be right back," I said. I took the folder. I walked out through the kitchen and out the back door and stood on my grandmother's back porch in the November cold, and I called my attorney, a woman named Diane who I had worked with through the Ardenvale acquisition and who I trusted completely. She picked up on the second ring. I described the document. I read her the consideration clause. I told her what my brothers had said. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "That's a quitclaim deed structured to strip your inheritance for nominal consideration. Do not sign it. Do not agree to sign it. And do not let them pressure you in that room." I already knew all of this. I had needed to hear someone else say it. I asked her one more thing. I said, "Is this actionable? If I can show that this was coordinated, that my grandmother was involved, that there was pressure applied." She said, "Let's talk about that when you're out of the house. But yes, depending on what's said and what documentation exists, there are several avenues." I thanked her. I stood there for another minute breathing the cold air. A neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the block. The yard looked the same as it had when I was 8 years old. Same overgrown rose bushes my grandfather always meant to trim. I went back inside. Callum looked relieved when I sat down, which told me something. "Everything okay?" Seth asked. Fine, I said. I set the folder on the table. I'm not going to sign this. The room changed. It's hard to describe. It wasn't loud. Nobody stood up or raised their voice. It was more like a collective recalibration, everyone adjusting to a scenario they hadn't prepared for. I think you should read it more carefully, Callum said. His tone had shifted slightly. More careful now. I've read it, I said. I've also described it to my attorney in the last 4 minutes, and she agrees with my read. Seth laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound. You have an attorney? I do. My grandmother said softly, Sweetheart, we're just trying to keep things simple. I looked at her, and this was the hardest part. Harder than anything Callum said. Harder than the document itself. I loved my grandmother. I still love her. And I also understood, sitting there, that she had let this happen. Maybe she hadn't designed it. Maybe Callum had come to her with a plan and she had trusted him the way she always trusted the oldest, the loudest, the one who presented himself as the one who knew how things worked. But she had let me drive 4 hours to sit in this room and she hadn't warned me, and she hadn't put a folder in front of my chair. I understand what you're trying to do, I said to her, but I can't sign this. It isn't fair, and you know it isn't fair. She didn't argue. She looked at the dried flowers. Callum said, I don't understand why you're being difficult about this. You don't even live near here. What are you going to do with 1/3 of a house in Franklin? The same thing you are, I said. Hold an asset. You don't have the financial standing. Callum. I said his name the way our mother used to say it when she was done with a conversation. He stopped. I reached into my bag. I had brought one document of my own, not because I had planned to use it today, not exactly, but because I had learned in the last few years that it was better to have things written down. I set it on the table. It was a summary statement from my brokerage account, not the full statement. Just the summary page, with the account value and my name. I slid it across to Callum. He looked at it. His expression shifted in a way I had never seen on his face before. Seth leaned over to see, and his expression shifted too. The account value on that statement was just under $1.8 million. That didn't include the condo, or the equity stake I still held in a smaller startup, or the real estate investments. I let them look at it for a moment. I'm not going to sign the deed, I said. I'm not going to be managed out of my inheritance because you've decided I can't afford to hold it. And I want you to know that I have full intention of being present for whatever comes next with this property. The decisions, the finances, all of it. I have the resources and I have the time, and I have an attorney who I can call in under 2 minutes. Callum set down the statement. He didn't say anything for a long time. My Aunt Roberta said quietly, Good for you, honey. Seth said, Where did, and then stopped himself. My grandmother looked up at me. Not at the statement. At me. And her expression was something complicated that I haven't fully decoded even now. Pride, maybe. Or recognition. Or something more like grief for the version of events she had imagined. She said, I didn't know. I believe her. That's the thing. I believe she didn't know, and I believe that's its own kind of failing, that she had let Callum fill in the picture of who I was, without ever checking with me directly. I know you didn't, I said. The meal that followed was the strangest of my life. My grandmother heated up the pot roast she had made, and we sat around the table where the folders still lay, and nobody talked about the deed, and nobody talked about the brokerage statement, and we ate and passed the bread basket, and my aunt asked me about my drive down, and I answered her. Callum said almost nothing. He ate quickly. He left before dessert. Seth stayed longer. Before he left, he pulled me aside in the hallway and said, I didn't know what was in those documents. Cal said it was a formality. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, okay, he didn't know what to do with that. Most people, when they confess something and the other person just says, okay, expect more, absolution or anger. I didn't have either to give him right then. In the weeks after, I spoke to Diane several times. Depending on how things developed, there were options. A formal accounting of the estate, A partition action if the property ownership became contested. Documentation of what had been said in that room. I had taken notes in my car before I drove home that night, written down the exact language Callum had used, because I had learned during the acquisition process that what people say and what they later claim to have said are often different things. I also called my grandmother, twice. She called me back once. We talked for 40 minutes about things that were not the house. Her garden, a TV show she was watching, a woman from her church who had broken her hip. We were rebuilding something, slowly, in the way that you do when the easier version of a relationship has been shown to be built on assumptions that didn't hold. She has not asked me about the document again. Callum has not contacted me. Seth texted me a month later to ask how I was doing, and I texted back that I was well and asked about his kids, and it was almost like nothing had happened. Which is the thing about family. The silences grow around the things you can't say until the shape of what isn't talked about is visible to everyone and acknowledged by no one. I don't know exactly what happens next with the property. I know my third is mine. I know I'm not signing anything I haven't had reviewed. I know that the version of me my family had carried around for 31 years, the one who could be managed, who didn't have the financial standing, who would go along because she always had, that version is not available to them anymore. I drove home that Sunday evening. The highway was clear, which is rare, and I had the kind of drive where you're not really thinking, just moving through darkness with the headlights ahead of you and the music low. I stopped for coffee at a rest stop just past the state line. I stood in the parking lot for a minute before going back to the car. It was cold. The sky was very clear. I had not told anyone in that room about Ardenvale. I hadn't mentioned the acquisition. I hadn't explained the full picture. I had shown them one piece of one account and let them figure out the shape of the rest. Because here's what I've learned about the moment when the people who underestimated you finally understand they've been wrong. It doesn't actually feel like winning. It feels quieter than that. It feels like setting down something heavy that you'd gotten so used to carrying you had forgotten the weight had a name. That weight had a name. It was the version of me they had decided I was. I left it in my grandmother's dining room, next to the dried flowers and the unsigned deed and the breadbasket nobody touched. I got back in the car. I drove home. I made tea when I got in, and I sat in my own kitchen, in my own condo, and I was fine. Not triumphant. Not vindicated in the way the word usually sounds, just fine. Just mine. Just clear. There's something I've thought about a lot since that Sunday in my grandmother's dining room. Not about Callum, not about the deed, not even about the number on that brokerage statement. I've thought about the $10. $10. That's what they decided I was worth. Not out of cruelty exactly. I don't think Callum woke up that morning thinking he was doing something monstrous. I think he genuinely believed the version of me he had carried around for 30 years. The little sister who needed help. The one without the resources. The one who would go along because she always had. He wasn't lying about who he thought I was. He just hadn't bothered to check in a very long time. And that's the thing I keep coming back to. The assumptions people make about you aren't always malicious. Sometimes they're just lazy. People build a picture of you early, and then they stop looking, and the picture becomes the person in their mind, and they act on the picture without ever checking whether it still resembles you at all. Callum's picture of me was from 2019, from the car repair I had to borrow money for. He never updated it. He just kept making decisions based on an image that was years out of date. What I've learned, not as some tidy lesson, but genuinely from experience, is that your life is not obligated to announce itself to the people who've decided what it is. I didn't owe my brothers a press release about Ardenvale. I didn't owe anyone an explanation of my finances or a correction of their assumptions. I just had to keep building, quietly, and let the truth be what it was when the moment required it. That's not strategy. It's just what happens when you stop performing for an audience that was never really watching you anyway. The harder part, and I don't want to skip over this because it's the part that actually cost me something, was my grandmother. Sitting across from her and understanding that she had let it happen, even without fully knowing what she was letting happen. That's what grief looks like when it isn't clean. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits there in the room while you pass the bread basket. What I know about integrity, about the real kind, not the kind you perform, is that it requires you to hold on to what's yours even when the people around you have decided it doesn't belong to you. Not with anger, not with a speech, just with clarity. I knew what that deed was the moment I read the consideration clause. I knew because I had spent years learning to read things carefully, to ask the right questions, to call the right people. That knowledge didn't come from nowhere. It came from choosing over and over to take my own life seriously even when no one else in that room was doing so. And the resilience part, the part that I think gets misunderstood most, is not about being tough or unaffected. I cried on the drive home, somewhere around mile marker 40. Not because I had been hurt exactly, but because I had seen clearly something I had always half known, that I had been carrying a weight I never needed to carry, a weight made entirely of other people's low expectations, and I had been carrying it so long I had almost mistaken it for my own. I set it down. That's the whole story, really. Callum has the picture of me he built in 2019. I have the life I built while he wasn't looking. Only one of those things is real.